Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Sakicha Trio Plot, natural processed Ethiopia from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore. And their coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Tepi Playa, the wash processed Bolivian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that we had also picked up the natural processed Ethiopian coffee from Mood Trap, and that is this one right here, as I was very fortunate to be the very last order number that did receive this coffee, as Mood Trap did update on their Instagram that they had run out of this coffee, and luckily for me, I had that last order. So hopefully this review will act as a consolation to anybody that might not have received this coffee. Looking forward to discussing it as well, as this right here is day 67. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly toned down recipe at a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. And obviously we include a photo of the coffee beans at the start of every single review, and you can see just how light this coffee is, given that this is a natural, as the beans themselves are shaded extremely light, which is in line with our experiences with Mood Trap, as once again they are an extremely light roasting coffee roaster, one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters out there, and that is very much on par with our previous experiences, which is to say that this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 40, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was definitely offering an abundance of natural characteristics with a slight bit more of some fermenty berries and a slightly grainy quality as well. A bit more intense than initially expected, lending itself towards an okay start. And the main reason I say that is because I remember when purchasing this coffee, it was described as being a little bit more washed Ethiopian-like, and I was initially expecting that experience, but given that there was an abundance of slightly more fermenty and grainy qualities, I could say that was certainly not the first impression I'd had, though I knew that it was just the first impression, and it was obviously subject to change from this point going forward. So on day 43, we opted for the V60, and the struggles continued, as right off brew, it continued to offer that strong graininess that settles much more as the cup does cool down, though it is still slightly present throughout the entirety of this coffee. Classic natural Ethiopian berry characteristics in abundance, with some slightly intense stone fruit aspects as well. Cup is relatively heavy, though slightly better this second time around, so it's improved from that first try. Day 46 through the April brewer, and the cup does continue to remain pretty consistent, with a pretty intense cup offering more of the natural characteristics in a slightly heavier stone fruit sense and a berry sense as well. A little less grainy, so I'm noticing that the graininess does seem to dissipate every single time we're brewing it, so hopefully by the end we'd get notably less of that. Day 49 through the V60, and I decided, you know what, let's push this coffee because I'm sure that's what you guys want to see. I'm sure you want us to see what we can get from this coffee by pushing it as much as we can. It went more fine on the grind, and there's a high level of intensity to the cup, as it's mostly skewing in the natural berry sense again. Still feels like some adjustments are needed, which is kind of a nice way of saying it was still a little too heavy, a little too fermenty for me. So on day 52, we opted for the Chemex with lower temperatures and a lower concentration, and this was a complete turnaround for me, as this time I could say that the coffee is by far the best it's been, with significantly cleaner and better defined stone fruit aspects in the cup, and much more of the berry-like tones once again. Significantly less graininess with plenty of sweeter fruit intensity. So this was a lovely day, and I said, okay, I think this is much more of what we're going for from this coffee, so let's just focus on this from this point going forward. Day 55 through the V60 with the same adjustments, and it's helped this brew method as well. So these notably strong adjustments we had made has really seemed to just kind of help with the overall clarity and cleanliness of the coffee, and that allowed for a much more clean base for a better defined fruit profile within it, and that seemed to be the case with it offering a very straightforward sugary and intense yellow fruit tone to the cup, much better this time around. Day 58 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it does continue to offer the best experience we've had with the coffee, including a better defined berry quality and a sweeter, almost syrupy stone fruit to the cup. Final note we have day 61 through the V60 with our earlier recipe, and the cup is pretty nice as it is still slightly grainy that hinders the overall clarity, but for the most part, sweet and syrupy stone fruits remain the most prominent aspect, complemented by a slightly heavier dark berry tone, perfumey florals, and some strong spice savory tea aspects as well, which is something I haven't discussed too much. They do have some tea-like note list on here, which is why I can definitely see that, but for the most part, I think the coffee was skewing a lot more on what you would expect from a natural processed Ethiopian coffee in terms of the heavier fruit tones, and that's why I decided to focus on and highlight those aspects. But the tea-like savoriness was also present within this, which will be demonstrated in the tasting wheel. But as I'm kind of going through these notes, it did make me realize that we had some really positive experiences with the Chemex, so maybe in hindsight, that's the way I should have opted for the final cup of this coffee, because those experiences I had on day 52 and day 58 both sound really good, and as I'm thinking about them, they were both slightly nicer than what I'm experiencing here on this mark as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's start with the finish level 4. And it's interesting to me, so this coffee definitely has plenty of those natural-like characteristics to it. This coffee, pretty much any time we've brewed the coffee and we're doing these reviews, they're pretty much at room temperature by the time we're consuming them. And it's so interesting to me because a lot of the fermentiness, a lot of the heaviness is gone when this coffee does reach room temperature. As I'm drinking this right now and I'm thinking to myself, yeah, it doesn't have that same sort of lingering, very strong, intense aspect to it. It's there, but it's much cleaner as there's significantly less of the fermentiness or graininess to the cup. So initially, off brew, the finish can skew a little bit more in that heavier sense, but as you let the coffee cool down, it's definitely notably improved and you're getting a much cleaner fruit profile to it. So that's to kind of discuss the differentiating factors within the finish based off of the temperature of the coffee itself. Sweetness level 4, not surprising in any regard. This is a very sweet coffee. We are working with a natural processed Ethiopian coffee right here, and it'd be a little surprising if it didn't at least reach that mark. All of the sweetness comes from a much more, let's say, fruit-like nectar, that very strong fruit sugariness to it. So definitely justified there at that level 4 mark. Acidity level 4, and I remember making this tasting wheel and thinking to myself, once again, we're scoring pretty high on the brightness for these Mood Trap coffees, and this one definitely offered a fair bit of that throughout the entirety of it, so justified there at the level 4, which is kind of interesting given the much more toned down recipe we opted for with this coffee. Florals level 4, and that's usually something I experience with a lot of natural processed Ethiopian coffees in a much more perfumey-like sense, so I can definitely think a lot more of those perfumey jasmine-like tones or lavender-like tones that are present within this one, because they do come in a slightly more dark sense. That's in line with the next thing we're discussing, the berry fruit there at that level 4, and I can definitely see a slightly heavier fermented berry within this one. I want to say blueberries, though maybe not necessarily quite as well defined, so just a, we'll say, generally more darker berry tone that's present within this coffee, thinking maybe even a little bit more of those grape-like aspects. Stone fruit level 4, and if I recall correctly, I think that was one of the notes. The coffee was actually removed from Mood Trap's website, I want to say not too long after the coffee had been sold, so I couldn't even look back and see what the notes they had listed on this coffee were. If I recall, I do believe it was one of the stone fruit aspects, so I think that that's what they were going for within this coffee, and I could definitely see it, as it definitely came in a much more sugary and intense sweet aspect for this coffee. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the spice level 3. I briefly mentioned that there is that spiced-like tea tone to this coffee, and that goes in line with the savoriness because both of those things were very prominent. I believe once again that there was a tea-like note to this coffee, so that would make a lot of sense given the overall experience to it. And it's so interesting for me with this coffee as you do have a lot of those natural Ethiopian characteristics in the floral and fruit sense, but I was thinking to myself, there is this very notable depth to it that does come in that slightly more savory sense. So that was an interesting component to this coffee for me. Citrus fruit level 3, I just remember making this tasting wheel and thinking to myself, there's enough of a citric tone to it, even if it's not overly well defined, to justify bumping it up on the higher side of things. Body level 3 definitely had a little bit more texture to it, and I think that could be attributed to the fact that we did opt for the V60 at the end of the day as opposed to the Chemex for this one. Though once again, I think there might be some slight differences in overall experience and marks on this tasting wheel if we had opted for the Chemex. Final thing worth discussing is the most important thing, the cleanliness level 3. So maybe on the earlier days, I could say it was on the lower side of level 3, and I felt like I was working towards a level 4, and I could even say at certain times when brewed with a Chemex, it was possibly close enough to justify that level 4 mark, but at the end of the day, you can definitely tell that you are drinking a natural processed Ethiopian coffee, mostly because of the very strong intensity to it, and I think at the end of the day, the biggest thing that kind of held it back from scoring that level 4 was I still experienced a little bit of the graininess, even as it had dissipated from time to time within the cup. It was present enough to say this is not truly as clean as your everyday wash processed coffee, so for that reason I have to keep it there at that level 3, though it really did fight the good fight to get there at that level 4 in terms of the cleanliness. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. There were a lot of positives to take away from it, but truth be told, I had a, we'll say, notable preference towards the wash-processed Bolivian coffee, which I feel like a lot of people would consider to be the more boring of the two coffees, but I think clarity goes a long way. And since this one didn't truly reach that level 4 mark, then that's obviously going to hold it back from being one of the more enjoyable natural processed coffees that we've had this year, especially since we have had some very nice natural and slightly more processed coffees that have justified reaching that level 4 mark. So this one not necessarily reaching there does kind of take away from that in the overall picture of things. But once again, there are so many positives to take away from this. It was cleaner relative to the average natural nonetheless. It offered plenty of depth to the fruit components to it rather than just being a little bit more one-dimensional. It wasn't overbearing or intense in any regard. At no point would I say this coffee was just too much. It was too strong. It was too intense, especially for somebody that seems to have a little bit of an issue with too many coffees in this processing method being that way. So all of those things are really nice positives to take away. In addition to that, it's not just one-dimensional and boring as far as natural processed Ethiopians go, because it does offer that additional savory like tea aspect to it as well. So plenty of positives to take away. And the type of person I would suggest this coffee to is your extremely light profiled natural processed Ethiopian coffee drinker, because it is still offering all of those tones that you're expecting and hoping for within this coffee, especially in regards to the fruit profile with, we'll say, above average clarity as well. And still, once again, that lighter profile, as once again, there is that surprisingly notable bit of brightness to the cup as well. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Sakicha Tree Up Natural Processed Ethiopia from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.